Small towns keep secrets. In the Pacific Northwest, fog doesn't just fall, it arrives with purpose, as if it has places it needs to hide. Tonight, we unpack 9 small-town horrors gathered from first-hand testimony, police reports, archived newspapers, and recordings where they exist. Names and some locations have been altered for safety. What follows is not urban myth. These are the accounts of people who woke up to a world that no longer made sense. My method is simple. I read the files, spoke where I could to witnesses and to those who handled the initial reports, and I matched the memories to whatever paper trail remained. Where a claim is extraordinary, you'll hear me qualify it. Where an archive exists, I will say so. Where a person told the story in the first person, you'll hear a short excerpt from them. These reports are, by nature, fragmented. An open gate, a fragment of cloth, a photo someone swears they did not take. The common thread is the way ordinary nights bent into something else. If this kind of late-night investigation is the sort of thing you come back for, hit subscribe and ring the bell. There's more like this in the playlist. 1. The Faceless in the Fog, Patterson Cottage, name altered. He marked the hour on his phone before he'd even understood he was marking anything. 3:12 a.m., the notification said. Dense fog advisory. He joked to himself, logging weather, Washington winters, then noticed the yard. The fog came every night like clockwork, creeping across the ground so fast it seemed to walk, swallowing the chain-link fence, the mailbox, the last of the neighbor's porch light, until the world outside his windows reduced to a radiator of gray. The renter was 24, an on-call welder who worked odd shifts at the mill and rented a small cottage on the edge of town from a local landlord known only to the file as Mr. Patterson. He rented the place because it was cheap and because it sat at the end of a gravel lane where no one knocked harder than the wind. The cottage's back door faced an old cedar grove and a run of scrub that sloped into a marsh. In that marsh, the fog liked to gather. The first night he noticed something, it was little more than a smear in the fog, a darker vertical that didn't fill into shape as a tree or post should. He told himself it was a deer standing stock still. He kept watch from his kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. At 3:47 a.m., when his phone lit up with a text from a coworker, the heat of the light made him blink, and the smear had moved closer. It remained motionless, impossibly thin, a silhouette of a person who did not cast a shadow. It stopped beneath the back window and lingered there until the fog thinned enough for him to see a smooth, featureless surface where a face ought to have been. He says, according to his report, it was like glass with nothing behind it. If I moved my head, it didn't follow. It just pressed against the frame like a thing testing the house. He called the landlord, who chuckled and said the place had been vacant for months and that the fog came from the old creek. Mr. Patterson suggested security cameras. The renter installed 2 battery cameras on the eaves, cheap models that pinged a cloud server every night. The first 3 nights captured nothing but the fog moving like a slow tide. On night 4, a clip shows the fog arriving at 3:08 a.m. A shape organizes within it, tall, narrow. The image is poor. The camera struggles to focus through the moisture. As the shape approaches the porch, the audio track registers a faint pressure change, a rise and fall, like someone breathing through a cloth. The figure stands at the back door for an indeterminate length of time. When the camera's timestamp jumps, the figure seems to be nearly on the door. Then there is a clean cut. The file is missing 2 minutes. This 2-minute gap in a single camera feed is all the formal evidence the town had to go on. A neighbor reported hearing a muffled banging that night, but could not identify it. Mr. Patterson told the reporting deputy he had rented the cottage to someone else in 2015, a renter who was recorded in the landlord's ledger as moving in on May 3rd and moving out, allegedly, on May 24th. The ledger shows nothing more. According to archived local newspapers, a string of disappearances happened in May across the 1970s, 11 people in 7 years, all last seen near the marsh after fog events. The files are redacted where the coroner's notes mention undetermined movement beyond perimeter. Police performed a routine check. The renter fled the property in daylight that same week. He told the responding officer he felt watched and would not return to sleep there. He turned his key into Mr. Patterson and left the county within hours. The renter later told a reporter, "I couldn't keep living there. Every morning I woke up with the back of my neck sleek with sweat, like something had been there all night." He has not gone back, and according to the file, Mr. Patterson closed the cottage to new renters for safety's sake. The local paper ran a small column months later about how odd rentals were decided to be left empty during May, citing nothing more than tradition and superstition. What complicates this is the pattern.
The archival clipping, dated 1976 and pulled from the county archive, lists several missing persons cases clustered between late April and mid-May. Neighbors interviewed in the clipping speak of a season of fog that rolls inland from the coast in those years like a tide with teeth. Other longtime residents remember church meetings where older men warned younger ones not to go out after the fog. These are recollections, not hard evidence, but they match the renters here. The fog came with a timetable, and it seemed to favor late spring nights.
The most disturbing image in the file is a letter from a woman identified only as M. She wrote to the sheriff after losing her brother in 1977. In her poem-like account, she names the blank face that looks in my window. She closes by saying, "If you find him in June, please tell me I didn't imagine the things the fog taught him." That letter sits in a weathered folder with dried coffee rings and the sheriff's terse note, "No further leads." The case went cold, not because the police stopped looking, but because the evidence refused to bend to clear explanation. The renters' battery cams have been kept in property evidence for years, occasionally requested by independent researchers in the county. In one of the requested viewings, the footage again stops for a matter of seconds, as if the recorder chose to look away. When the footage resumes, the back door latch is slightly ajar. He left and never returned. He later told a local journalist, "I still have dreams of fog pressing against glass. Sometimes I wake up and I think my neighbor's porch light is the same as that face." According to follow-up interviews, he relocated out of state and rarely speaks of the cottage. The landlord retired in place. The cottage remains empty in the photographs used by a local realtor site. The listing marks the exterior as "needs work." Locals say, off the record, that the real estate company doesn't even show it in person. If it were only one strange sighting, you could call it a mental misfire, a coincidence of weather and exhaustion. But the town's archives bear out reported disappearances in that May window, old men who lock their doors and never walk near the marsh when the forecast calls for coastal clouds. The renter's camera, the ledger entries, Mrs. M's letter. Pieces of a pattern that never quite snaps into place. According to the sheriff's notes filed in 1978 and again in 2016, there was no evidence of abduction or reportable predation, only empty air and stopped clocks. Before I move on, if this kind of deep dive into small-town mysteries is what you want, hit subscribe and ring the bell. There are more files ahead. 2. The blood trail that ends. County Road 18. Name and town altered. It begins in the report, like many missing person calls do, a pickup truck found with its door open in a gravel turnout, keys in the ignition, the driver's seat warm. The paradox is the blood trail, small but unmistakable, a line of crimson drops leading from the truck into a stand of young pines, where the underbrush becomes difficult to see at night. The dispatcher who took the initial call, identified in the investigative summary as a 28-year-old woman, recalled the call as cold and small, like a thing's throat used as a faucet. When deputies followed the trail, it led them up a slope and into an alveolus of trees where the rich, dark soil chewed up light. The drops stopped abruptly at a mossy root that looped like a knuckle. No body.
Nothing more than damp impressions in the ground, a shoe print whose pattern had been washed somewhat by rain the previous afternoon. The truck's owner, a man who worked in logging, was not there. The truck's logbook showed a work shift that ended at 9:20 p.m. The missing man's wallet and phone were found under the truck seat. His hat was folded neatly in the passenger footwell. His lunch cooler sat locked in the bed. Weeks later, according to the coroner's report, a body was found 12 miles away, on a stretch of land that faces the ocean, in a direction opposite to the way the blood trailed. The body had injuries consistent with exposure and blunt force, though the report carefully records inconclusive trauma sequence. The timeline didn't match simple flight. The dispatcher, whose name is protected in the file, continued to take calls for years. She told an investigator in 2019, "I can hear those drops when I'm trying to sleep. They were small, almost polite, and then they were gone." Investigation notes show security footage from a Millgate camera that captures the missing logger at 8:57 p.m., walking to a cluster of 3 men. The footage is grainy, bottled in sodium vapor light. A hand grabs his shoulder. Voices are exchanged. The 3 men were identified in a later list as mill workers and were questioned as persons of interest. According to the investigative summary, all 3 were cleared for lack of conclusive evidence. 1 man later moved out of state. Another remained in town and refused to be interviewed on record for this report. The third was listed in a brief note as cooperated with initial inquiries. The oddities multiply. The blood trail ends at a clump of roots where the undergrowth looks, according to field notes, like it had been disturbed and then settled wrong, as if something heavy had been shifted and then replaced. Yet the body 12 miles away bore no consistent track connecting it to that place. There were no tire tracks linking the two sites in a way the county could document. The coroner's report suggests death had been unlikely to occur where the blood trail stopped. The victim had lived some hours beyond that point. Locals whispered about old forestry roads that wind in circles and dead ends that confuse even GPS devices, but whispers are not evidence. In the months after the discovery, the missing man's family left town. The house sold quietly. The dispatcher kept working and later left the county for mental health reasons, according to a note from a union representative. She told an interviewer, "You never stop checking over your shoulder after something like that. It changes how you treat silence." The sheriff's office listed the case as a cold case in 1991. It remains open in the sense of files kept on the shelf. There is a photograph in the file, low resolution and grainy, of the blood trail ending at the roots. The photographer's note in the margin reads, "Trail stops, no body. Soil looks tampered."
Another note, in handwriting that appears to be the lead deputy's, says simply, "Follow-up, no witnesses, counsel family." That's the kind of bureaucratic tenderness that happens after something incomprehensible. Paperwork attempts to fold the edges back in. 3. Mercy General and Lily. Repeat hitchhiker sightings. Highway route. Name altered. You see a woman standing on the edge of an interstate in winter light, and your first thought is to stop. Professional drivers tend to be cautious. It's the nature of long hours and open highways. The long-haul driver who had come to be central to this file had been on similar routes for 2 decades. He was used to late-night pickups at rest stops and the odd hitchhiker in distress. What he reported in his later interviews is that he picked a young woman up 3 times over the course of months, always at night, always between the same 2 exits, always asking for Mercy General. The driver says the first time she climbed into his cab shivering, hands white around the cup of coffee he'd offered. She smelled of antiseptic and river mud. She said only, "Mercy General," and each time he would ask her which part of town, her voice would fade. The driver would point his rig toward Mercy General. On arrival, which the driver described to the recorder as the side door that doesn't exist in normal architecture, the woman would step down from the cab and walk up a paved embankment that led to a stretch of blank concrete wall. The first time, the driver followed her up the embankment to ask if she needed assistance. The wall had no door. There was no steps. She was gone. He told a friend later, in a recorded phone message turned over to an investigator, "I walked that wall until the sun came up. There's nothing there but an old loading bay filled with weeds." He would report the incident to truck stops and to a local informal drivers network. Over months, others corroborated similar sightings. A young woman asking for Mercy General whose face nobody could quite name, whose clothes looked like they came from different eras depending on who saw her. One driver remembered a pair of shoes that were wrong for the year behind her heels. Mercy General itself, according to county records, was an institution with a long history. It was built in the 1940s, expanded into the 1960s, and partially demolished in the early 1990s after budget cuts and structural concerns. A 1984 incident report in hospital archives notes that a young woman named Lily Nelson, born 1962, was involved in a late-night traffic accident while trying to reach Mercy General in a storm. She died at the roadside. The report states she had been trying to get help for a friend. The hospital log marks her as attendee of emergency intake denied due to the triage crowd that night. The hospital's later resources show that an annex was closed in 1985 and raised a decade later. A memorial cross at the old roadside is listed in a regional bereavement block. The cross reads Lily Nelson, 1962-1984. Locals tell you, quietly, the truckers often stop there and touch the wood. The driver in question said he began seeing the woman in spring, and that by late summer, several drivers were trading stories over diner booths about the girl who asks for mercy. Some drivers would avoid the road near the old hospital entirely. Others, fewer, would pick her up and try to take her to the address she requested. Each time, the end result was the same. The woman would walk into a wall of nothing and disappear. To be clear, there is a recorded fatality in 1984 matched to a woman called Lily Nelson. The hospital was later demolished and much of its record archive moved to a county center. People who drove long routes claimed in interviews that the encounter remained consistent in manner, same request, same vanishing,
despite variations in clothing and weather. The truckers' calls to dispatch about the matter went on the record as unusual passenger reports. The county coroner has no open file linking repeated time-displaced sightings to the 1984 case, but the convergence of a named memorial and multiple independent sightings is the kind of pattern that keeps a community awake at night. This is a story about grief that won't rest, and about a building that, even after its physical removal, remains a locus for human expectation. The drivers told their tales in truck stop cafes and in recorded confessions to researchers who kept logs of apparition reports across the region. According to one driver who wished to remain anonymous, "Some of us take the long way round. It's not bravery, it's superstition. The ones who pick her up get nightmares. The ones who avoid her get a clean conscience and a cold shoulder from other drivers." 4. Static and reverse voices. KPNW radio station. Call letters preserved only in records. Night shifts at small radio stations attract a certain kind. The jaded college kid, the man who couldn't hold a day job, the technician who prefers the hum of a generator to conversation. The night maintenance technician at the county station, recorded in the files as night tech, worked graveyard shifts and recalled that the station's older transmitter room smelled like solder, stale coffee, and the dust of decaying paper. What he logged in a notebook handed to the archive was an oddness on one particular frequency. The clock hit 2:30 a.m. and the air did something the technician couldn't explain. He began to pick up transmissions that were wrong in their cadence, music that played backwards for long seconds before resolving into a coherent song, and voices that seemed to be tracked in reverse. The technician, who had some experience with old analog gear, initially assumed someone was doing a radio stunt. He ran a sweep of the frequency allocation and found nothing licensed to that band that night. He recorded minutes of the feed on a loop, thinking it was a prank.
When he slowed the tape down later in the control room, he heard, clearly and unmistakably, human voices pleading in sound that had been reversed at first and then patched together. "Help us. No light. The door." The recording, according to the file, was handed to the station manager and never made public. In the station's basement, an area seldom used, the tech found behind a false wall an old auxiliary transmitter that hadn't been logged in the station's blueprints. The transmitter was the kind built in the 1950s, heavy, analog, wired into the rock power lines, its faceplate pitted with rust. A logbook lay beside it, brittle and yellowed, with an entry dated November 1952. The entry lists a crew: Margaret Hayes, Thomas Ridley, Catherine Moore, and Sarah Ridley. The names matched a local article from 1952 about a studio fire that had in the public record been presented as contained to the antenna array and resulted in no casualties. The logbook's margin bore a single scrawl: "Do not let the signal out." When investigators excavated the lull in 2018, after the tech kept copies of the recording and persuaded a former reporter to look into the old files, the station yielded a small cavity behind the bricked-up concrete. According to a search warrant affidavit, human remains were found sealed within, the area likely cut for speed and then bricked to disguise the work. The skeletonized remains were later identified by dental records as belonging to the 4 staff members listed in the 1952 logbook. The coroner's report states the cause and manner of death were recorded as undetermined, consistent with smoke inhalation and blunt trauma. The station's official archive until then had only a brief entry noting a minor fire and equipment loss in a November 1952 press clipping. For 2 decades, the station broadcast and no one looked into the missing log entries. According to a former station manager's sworn statement, older engineers told stories about the wall that smelled of smoke no matter the weather, and the legend of the silent schedule was an offhanded thing told to new recruits. The discovery of the bones reopened an old wound in the county. The station closed unexpectedly, the technicians scattered. The night tech walked away with a thumb drive containing the backward-than-forward recordings and a stack of photocopied logbook pages. The recorded audio, when reviewed by independent forensic audio analysts at the request of a journalist, contains voices that sound both like panicked plea and like replicated radio artifacts, echoes and compression artifacts that mimic human syllables. The analysts recorded in their notes: segments reconstruct into intelligible phrases when reversed and slowed, phrases suggestive of entreaty or alarm but degraded beyond conclusive identification. In lay terms, it's eerie and suggestive, but it stops short of anything that would hold up as a confession in court.
Still, when the station's wall was opened and the remains were found, whatever skepticism remained in the community shifted toward grief and toward questions about who had authority to rewrite a narrative for decades. The tech's life changed. He gave his recordings to a local historian, who preserved them under a restricted access agreement in the county archive. Residents gathered, small groups with candles and memory sticks, outside the boarded station the day after the bones were identified. Some insisted the station had been hiding someone for years. Others said the building itself had been a container for shame long before bodies were an issue. One older listener said, off the record, "We all heard the whispers, but we thought radio was only good for gossip. It turned out to be much worse." This is where the files get their teeth. A local institution implicated not by rumor alone, but by physical evidence. The bones were real. The logbook names were real. What remains unresolved is motive and method. Why seal 4 bodies behind a wall?
Who decided that the public record would say minor fire? Those questions linger in the investigative reports like smoke. Between the whisper of the preserved tape and the crude bedding of brick and mortar, the town lost its faith in small explanations. The station's license was not renewed. The transmitter's iron core was eventually sold for scrap. The technician still keeps a copy of the recording. He told an interviewer, "Sometimes at night when the rain is thin, I can almost hear it again. Not the voices, just the pressure of the air, like a mouth closing." According to the archive notes, the radio tape remains in controlled custody. There is a connective tissue to these first 4 stories: fog and sound, things pressing against houses and walls, small technologies that record what the human eye struggles to make sense of. The cottage's camera missed 2 minutes. The trail of blood finishes in empty soil. Mercy General's absence does not stop the young woman from asking for entrance. The radio played back what could be cries. The physical remnants, camera footage, coroner files, logbooks, exist side by side with memory and fear, and the tension between them is where the real dread sits. 5. Harvest Festival Burial. Teaser. Beyond the fog and the broadcast static, there are gatherings where the community gathers and the harvest music is played, where the smiles on photograph faces freeze for a moment and something crowded slips into frame in the background. At one such festival, a young woman's discovery would force a town to choose between denial and exposure. She brought a shoebox of old film to a friend, and the pictures inside, grainy, sun-bleached, depicted a scene no one expected to see. The frame showed men in dress shirts and suspenders with shovels planted in a low pit, and an indistinct form laying on the dirt between them.
The woman who found the images, who we've identified in the files as a 22-year-old who grew up in the town, told her friend she had to leave after her discovery. A few days later, Henry, an older friend who insisted the photos were real and who gave the woman the evidence, died in what was ruled a hunting accident. I've followed the paper trail on that one. There are interview notes, a set of scanned pictures, and a sheriff's memo that shows the names of several town notables in the photos. The official outcome, as listed in the file, is inconclusive. The photographs themselves have been printed, copied, and circulated in a small chain of custody among outside investigators. The town's reaction, at least in the documents, was a mixture of legal caution and social cold shoulders. But I'm getting ahead of where the file in my hand allows me to close the chapter. The woman who kept the images left town under duress. The matter remains a scar in town memory, a place where the harvest song breaks into static. Between these open wounds lies a pattern: institution versus individual, silence in the name of keeping the town together, and the way ordinary celebrations can be the stage for extraordinary denials. The files here contain copies of the photos, a coroner's notation on Henry's death that reads, "accidental pending toxicology," and the woman's statement that she received a threatening letter the week after she went to an outside law firm. Don't go thinking these incidents are isolated freak shows. Each of these stories, in its own way, is about the dangerous consonance of place and secrecy, and they are only the start. End of this segment. 5. Harvest Festival Burial, the photographs that wouldn't be ignored. She brought the shoebox to the little antique table at the back of Millie's quilts, the way someone brings a wound to a friend, folded, careful, as if the box might spill more than pictures. The woman in the file was 22 when she opened those frames, born and raised in the town, regular at the festival stalls, someone the records described as quiet, reliable, community-minded. She told a friend that the film had belonged to an older neighbor who died, and that she had agreed to scan the images before a yard sale. The setup is banal: small town harvest, tractor parades, a pie eating contest. The festival ran every October on the town green, and according to the photograph captions and a few dated newspaper clippings, had the same faces in the crowd most years. The photographs in the shoebox, however, did not show the festival in its usual light. They were sun-bleached and overexposed in places. Other frames were crisp in a way that made details pop: shirt buttons, a watch face, the shadow of a shovel handle. The first oddity appears in frame 3, a group of men in dress shirts, shirt sleeves rolled, shovels in the ground, faces turned away from the camera as if to keep their identities private. Between their knees lay a pale, indistinct shape covered by a tarp or cloth. The angle made it impossible to tell for certain. The man who later became known as Henry, older, local, someone who frequently helped with festival logistics, brought the box to the woman and said, according to the interview notes, "You need to see this. These aren't just pictures." She remembers, "It looked like they were doing something after the fair. They were laughing in some frames, like they'd just finished a joke, and in the others, you could see dirt under the nails. I thought maybe it was an animal at first, but Henry kept saying, 'No, look at the hands, that's not an animal.'" The woman took copies of the images to an out-of-county photographer who confirmed the film's age was consistent with late 1970s emulsions, though he could not conclusively authenticate the scene. She also gave copies to an attorney in a neighboring city. The attorney, per his notes in the file,
advised turning them over to county investigators only if the woman felt safe. She did turn them over, but she did so through an intermediary, an outside advocacy group, because she feared local backlash. The sheriff's office wrote a brief memorandum that acknowledged receipt of the photographs and listed a handful of town notables who appeared in the frames. The memo is careful in tone. Photographs depict men engaged in activity consistent with burial, no definitive identification of victim visible. Recommend confidential interview with subject Henry and follow-up imaging. Consider third-party forensic analysis. The interview with Henry, according to the recording log, did occur. Henry insisted the photographs were misinterpreted and that the men were moving a large piece of wood for the bonfire. He later told the investigator, "You see what you want to see in a photograph when you're already thinking the worst." Weeks after the images were shared outside town, Henry was found dead on a hillside off a hunting trail. Officially, the coroner's report reads, "hunting accident, accidental discharge," with toxicology and ballistics claimed as inconclusive in a later addendum. The woman's attorney received, in the days that followed, an anonymous letter that included a photocopy of one of the festival frames and the simple line, "You shouldn't have taken this out of town." The letter did not bear a return address. The woman removed her name from the voter rolls and later sold her family's house and left the county entirely. Independent researchers who received the copies scanned them at high contrast and isolated patterns of soil on clothing consistent with a soft loam found in a creek bed a half-mile from town. A retired coroner who reviewed low-resolution scans told this project's filekeeper that the pattern resembled that of a body dragged or laid on raw earth. None of this was enough to convene a grand jury.
The sheriff's office ultimately closed its file with a memorandum. Insufficient evidence to proceed beyond initial interviews. Community relations at risk. Advise counsel. The aftermath for the woman was not merely physical removal from town. In her recorded statement to an out-of-state counselor, she said, "When I look at those pictures now, I can still hear the festival music. It breaks into pieces for me. I can't be in a crowd without thinking what they were doing under our feet." Henry's death, the letter, and the town's reluctance to press further created a pressure that favored forgetting. According to the file, a local newspaper withheld publication of the images after a meeting with town council members, citing community harm and ongoing privacy concerns. The paper's editor later resigned and refused public comment. This story feels, more than the others, like a hinge between secrecy and social enforcement. The images are small, the town's machinery large, and the people who tried to pull one thread found themselves isolated. It's also a pattern. An outsider's documentation, photographs, collides with local power structures and is quietly neutralized. A whisper of an interlude. Sometimes what haunts a town is not a ghost, but a line of faces in a photograph that refuses to stay still. We move on.
The local library housed a scrapbook with clippings, dated 1963, 1993, and 2023, each telling a version of the same story. 7 days of darkness, 7 days where radios and household appliances died, and at the end of the week, a family member missing. The files from previous decades are brittle, written in a voice that alternates between municipal complaint and folk memory. The town had adopted rituals,
leaving candles by the windows, locking the church doors, and turning a small festival into a watch. When the engineer was on site in 2023, he used an array of instruments to map the effect. He walked the perimeter with an EM field detector, a seismograph, and a handheld thermal camera. The seismograph recorded a low, pulsating vibration at a frequency below audible range, what he described in his report as a hum centered on an old spring cap in Count Square. The spring had been capped in 1892. Local history suggested once supplied the mill, and then when the mill closed, was repurposed into a decorative fountain that long ago stopped flowing. The engineer's notes repeatedly underscore a curious coincidence. The periodicity of the phenomenon tracked roughly to 30-year intervals and to a 7-day duration. The medical records included in the county archive note that in each migration a person went missing. Sometimes it was an elder, sometimes a young man who'd been last seen near the square. In 1993, the missing person returned 3 days after the blackout, with no memory of the week in question. In 1963, a man never returned. The engineer field notes from 2023 show that during the 7th night of the blackout, he detected with his instruments a sharp spike in the low-frequency vibration and a brief localized thermal anomaly near the capped spring. A neighborhood security camera, according to his report, captured 6 frames of darkness thicker than the night, like oil in the air, then a sudden pixel bloom, then normalcy. One resident recorded on a handheld camera a clip where a porch light extinguishes and then reignites with a dragging sound like a breath through an iron pipe. Some accounts in the files suggest the town treated these cycles as fatalistic lore. "We mark them on calendars," one longtime resident told a visiting journalist. "You lock up. You don't send kids to the square. You put your faith in small things." Others, particularly younger residents, pushed to investigate, drill into the spring, cut into the capped stone. The county council, according to minutes, denied most of these requests, citing public safety concerns and lack of funding for speculative inquiry. The engineer's most unsettling note is a short line in a page of technical diagrams. Weight displaced beneath cap, void volume/small chamber. Acoustics indicate expansion/contraction correlated to 7-day event. He recommended further geophysical survey. Funding was not approved.
The town's insurance carrier refused to underwrite experimental digs. The week ended as it always did. Power restored at dawn on the 8th day, appliances hummed, phones lit with missed calls, and a family reported a missing member. The missing person was never conclusively found. In at least one cycle prior, someone returned with a loss of time and a deep malaise. In another, there was no return. Whether a geological oddity, an unrecognized environmental hazard, or something else, the files showed the pragmatic response of small-town governance against an irrational phenomenon: caution, half measures, and an accumulation of local ritual. The engineer, in a later interview for this project's file, said, "There is a rhythm to the thing. It is not random. It suggests a system that resets. I couldn't, in good conscience, leave the data as it was without more study. But you can't get a grant for ghosts." The human beat is simple and chilling. People plan their lives around a week that might swallow a neighbor. They do not speak of the missing as much as they used to. The town erects a plaque to remember, not to explain, for those who crossed the silence. The plaque sits under a lamp that, according to residents, occasionally buzzes and then goes dead for a few seconds. There is an echo here of other stories in this series, a cyclical return of the uncanny, a town's attempt to domesticate the irrational through ritual rather than explanation. The files leave us with an engineer's map, a seismograph that looked like a heartbeat with a tremor, and an unsent recommendation to dig deeper. We move on. 7. Ranger cabin and the children who drew themselves back into the floorboards. The ranger who reported this file had been on the trail service for 20 years. He'd worked summer patrols and winter rescues and knew the woods like the lines on his palms. He was assigned to a remote cabin used for seasonal maintenance, 2 rooms, kerosene stove, a wall of hand-carved hooks. According to his report, the cabin sat on the edge of an old watershed, near an overgrown trail that had once been part of a wagon road. He found the drawings by accident. The cabin's floorboard in the corner of the sleeping loft had always squeaked. He pried up the board to fix a loose nail and discovered a folded scrap envelope. Inside were 19 small drawings, graphite on H paper, stick-figure children with round heads, houses with wavy chimneys, wagons, and people with hats. The drawings were dated in faded ink, June 1847, in a handwriting that resembled a ledger note in the park office. The ranger, per his statement, felt a cold and ridiculous tenderness and kept the drawings in his pack until he had time to catalog them. At night, after a week in the cabin, he began to hear what he described as child footsteps in the loft and then a whispering that seemed to come from the wall space. Cameras set up outside the cabin captured nothing but deer and the usual tilt of moonlight. A trail camera anchored to a tree on the approach path did, in the early hours, collect images that defy simple explanation. 7 frames where a group of small, pale figures in ragged clothing walked toward the camera from the trail. There was a little girl at the threshold, all pale, like the light had decided to wear her. She said very slowly, "Help us." And then she wasn't there. The latch was warm. The ranger checked the regional archives. Wagon train manifests and a missionary's travel diary mention a group of 10 families passing through in 1847 who were stricken by fever and exposure. A ledger in the County Historical Society lists 23 children unaccounted for, family unit dispersed on crossing. There is also a letter from a contemporary settler that speaks of a river of fog that took the smallest voices. None of these documents prove supernatural causality, of course, but they establish a historical pattern of loss, a community wound that predates electrification and industry. The Park Service conducted a careful archaeological sweep around the trail and the cabin. They found several items: a child's boot button, a bit of lead pipe, and, controversially, a cluster of charcoal marks beneath an overhang that could have been a campfire. Soil samples tested by a university lab returned an anomalous result in a patch roughly 6 feet from the cabin, residues consistent with organics and accelerated decomposition relative to the surrounding soil. The department logged the results as archaeological interest, no human bone located, further sampling recommended. Funding, again, was a limiting factor. The ranger's life changed. He filed a formal report and then requested reassignment. His supervisor's notes reflect mental health concerns, unusual auditory phenomena reported. He would not camp alone after that. He gave the drawings to the Historical Society and insisted they be placed in a climate-controlled folder and not on public display. The Society complied but included photocopies in an internal research packet. The last pages of the ranger's notebook are thin with worry. He wrote, "Sometimes at night I can hear them laughing in the wind. It's always children. It smells like pine and old paper when they're near." A visiting folklorist wrote in the margins of an interview transcript that these reports match regional tales of trails that insist, places where small presences are recorded repeatedly across centuries. This story links to the series' broader theme of continuity, loss that predates modern institutions, hauntings that are as much historical ledger as they are current terror. For a ranger, someone whose job is to steward and to rescue, encountering a plea from a century and a half ago is a professional and moral dissonance. The park put up a simple sign near the trailhead that asks visitors to respect fragile history and to stay on marked paths. Some hikers posted photos online of the cabin's door with little paper dolls tucked under the latch. The ranger did not respond to messages. From children to machines, from photographs to seismographs, the pattern is of things that refuse to rest. We press forward. The files show that he continued to cooperate with investigators, providing phone logs and receipts that helped establish his presence in Millie's the night the men spoke. The case did not produce any arrests. Men who had been named in initial reports were interviewed and released. The coroner's office eventually identified the remains as victims of an unrelated string of disappearances, and those identifications appear to close some files, but left the intimidation open. The harassment portion of the file is perhaps the clearest example of the social cost of being a witness in a small community. The salesman was not a crusader. He was a man who preferred to pass through. Yet his presence created friction. Threats in envelopes, the sense of being watched, a broken mailbox one autumn morning. These are the types of pressures that push witnesses away. The investigator's notes close with a line, "Witness relocated, further protection recommended if he returns." He did not return. The diner remains open. Regulars, according to patrons who spoke to a journalist years later, avoid the corner booth. The owner told a reporter that sometimes, late at night, she hears people whisper and then stop when a newcomer looks. She does not call the police about that. She polishes the counter and pours coffee, and the town keeps spinning its small routines. From a moral perspective, the file reads as a study in how silence is enforced, not by one dramatic act, but by 1,000 small intimations that make speaking rare and risky. The greatest deterrent is not the threat itself, but the social architecture that makes threats effective. 9. Havenbrook, the missing hours and the town you can't find twice. The most confounding file of the collection is in some ways the most modern. Havenbrook is the name given in the driver's account, the name she remembered and later told on an online forum of travelers who collect blink-and-you-miss-it towns. The 27-year-old driver was on a long haul when she followed a sign she'd assumed led to a gas station. The GPS barely registered the place. She eased into a small lot, gassed up, bought a soda, and chatted with the attendant, who seemed unusually nervous. The setup is small and ordinary, a slice of time in the middle of a day. The strange moment is that when she stepped back into her car, the pump read 4:15 p.m. on the receipt, but her dash clock and phone displayed 7:12 p.m. The time discrepancy totaled nearly 3 hours. She had, she said, no memory of what took up the missing interval. She checked a lot, and the attendant told her urgently and quietly that she needed to leave and never return. "It's better you don't stay," the attendant allegedly said, pushing her lightly toward the driver's seat. She could not find the town again. The road map showed only highway and roadside scrub. She turned around and drove for an hour and found only the next exit's resources and a stretch of highway with no sign of the station.
She posted about her experience in a tight-knit online community for long-haul drivers and received replies that ranged from supportive to mocking. Then a pattern emerged. Dozens of posts from people who claimed, according to the thread, similar experiences. A cafe waitress who remembered a man who vanished between her orders. A hiker who took a wrong turn and found a town that smelled like old books and time. A delivery driver who claimed that the paper in a courthouse in town had different dates on the same page. Forum threads compiled under the heading Havenbrook and the Lost Hours contained anecdotal receipts, photo timestamps, and grainy dashcam footage. Police files are thinner. Where physical evidence exists, it's often small. Receipts with inexplicable timestamps, surveillance cameras that show someone in the lot and then a daylight gap with no activity, or an attendance note that reads, "Warned by regulars to, quote, move on." A 2011 county investigator noted in a marginal report, multiple witness statements suggest transient pattern of temporal displacement concentrated around a location generically called Havenbrook, no physical location pinned. Some of the forum contributors posited theories familiar to readers of fringe literature, time slips, pocket dimensions, and anomalies related to geomagnetic fluctuations. Serious investigators in the file caution against such leaps. The driver's own after effects were mundane but debilitating. She experienced anxiety when approaching rural towns. She checked clocks compulsively, and she avoids the highway where she remembers entering that county. According to her later testimony to an interviewer, it wasn't like waking up in the wrong place. It was like waking up on the other side of a window. Everything was the same, but not in the same order. I felt small, like part of a page had been torn. Where the file gets interesting is in how many of these accounts converge not on physical proof, but on the residue of time. Mismatched receipts, photos with different light than the timestamp suggests, a phone that records a call with a duration that doesn't match the log. The investigator's note reads, "The strongest evidence is consistency across independent testimonies. The weakest is lack of physical coordinates." That sentence is an investigator's lament. A pattern is visible but slippery. Havenbrook functions in the data as a meta-story in this collection, an emblem of the way small towns can be less fixed than a map suggests, less a point than a relation.
For some witnesses, it's a place best not visited twice. For others, it's a puzzle to be solved. For the driver, it's a scar, a 3-hour blank that re-edited her life in small, persistent ways.
Aftermaths, threads, and the weight of unspeakable things. Across these 9 accounts, faceless shapes in fog, a blood trail that ends without a body, a hitchhiker who wants a demolished hospital, voices trapped in old airwaves, photographs that point toward burial, a town that goes dark every 30 years, children's drawings tucked under floorboards, a diner witness who was silenced, and a town that eats hours. The real story is not any single eerie detail. It's the scaffolding the towns build around their strangeness, the unspoken rules, the quiet discouragements, the ways that communities default to preservation over inquiry. Look through the files and you'll see repetition. People who try to document are isolated, disbelieved, intimidated, or quietly persuaded to leave their evidence with out-of-town allies. Institutions, the sheriff's office, the church, the paper, appear with good intentions and the procedural friction of limited resources. Where proof is physical, it is often ambiguous. A camera with 2 missing minutes, a blood trail that stops at roots, bones behind a wall with a half-explained logbook. Where proof is absent, memory is the archive, letters, oral traditions, and the worn signboards that mark the town square. The connective tissue is not only social, but atmospheric. Fog functions as both literal weather and metaphor. It is the medium that obfuscates, preserves, and perhaps isolates. Sound recurs, the hiss of a radio, the faint pressure near a camera, children's laughter that isn't quite a memory. Time itself is a theme, cycles that repeat, hours that vanish, decades that carry their own echoes. The files are also careful about causality. Investigators who survived the events remain careful in their language. When a sheriff's memo says possible local complicity, it does not indict. When a coroner's notation reads undetermined, it refuses certainty. This is not accident. It's the work of good record-keeping in the face of unexplainable data. The cumulative effect, however, is a kind of case for persistent unease. 9 separate incidents that, taken together, suggest a region in which ordinary life frequently encounters the uncanny. Human beings adapt. They build rules. One town keeps its cottages vacant in May. Another sets up a watch during the 30-year blackout. Yet adaptation is not reconciliation. In several files, the witnesses do not move on. They are quietly damaged. The welder who left his cottage never came back. The dispatcher hears drops of blood in her sleep. The truckers avoid a stretch of highway. The night technician preserves a backward recording and cannot forget the sound. The woman with the photographs cut contact and sold her house. The ranger moved to a less remote post. The traveling salesman changed his route in his nights. The driver never again trusts an ordinary gas receipt. What remains unresolved is where the burden of proof should rest.
Does one single piece of undeniably physical evidence, a logbook, a set of dental records, a buried set of bones, turn rumor into investigation? Sometimes it does. In the radio station case, the discovery of human remains compelled an inquiry that unrolled decades of obfuscated reporting. But even that revelation did not answer motive. It only made the silence harder to live with. If there is a moral here, it isn't a neat one. Small towns are fertile ground for secrecy because they mix intimacy with dependency. If everyone depends on each other for work, schools, and daily life, then the cost of accusation can be very high. That social calculus shapes how mysteries are handled, as threats to be hidden, as problems for which to trade silence, or as things to be ritualized and managed. A final note about sources and evidence. Where I say, according to the file, the archive shows, or the witness reported, that is a marker of how the material in this project was treated. Photographs were scanned and copied, recordings were archived with custodian notes, and interviews were conducted with people who agreed to be recorded or who left written statements. In many instances, names and places were altered for safety, and in others I have used the names present in public records. Where extraordinary claims are made, they are accompanied by the cautionary qualifier you will have heard throughout this piece: alleged, reported, according to the witness. Phrases meant to respect both the testimony and the standards of evidence. If anything binds these files together beyond fog and sound, it is a human stubbornness. The stubbornness of people who will tell even the smallest truth despite pressure to remain silent. The shoebox, the friction tape, the seismograph, these are artifacts of witness. One last image to leave you with: a porch light that blinks once and stays off, a camera that skips 2 minutes and then resumes,
a town calendar marked in red and circled. These are the small, domestic signs that, when repeated, become an implausible chorus. They do not always add up to an answer. They do, however, make you look again at the map. If you know of a small-town story that belongs in this collection, if you have a receipt with the wrong hour, a photograph that doesn't fit the smile on the face, or a device that died at the edge of a town, share it in the comments. If you felt a fog press against your window, or heard a voice out of an old speaker, tell us below. We read every story and treat each with care. And if you want to continue these late-night investigations, like, subscribe, and check the playlist for more reports from the edges. For now, keep your porch light on and mind the edges of town. Sometimes the truth presses against glass, and sometimes it waits in the gray. Good night.